Mergers and acquisitions have been the name of the game in games really since Sony entered this space with their PlayStation brand back in the early 90s, but especially for the last 5 years or so with the inciting incident that really brought the practice into view for most people, being Xbox's buying spree of massive gaming corporations like Bethesda, Mojang, or most recently, Activision Blizzard. Initially, for most fans that didn't specifically have a fanboyism-induced bias against Xbox, of course, this was met with varying degrees of acceptance, if not straight up excitement, as was typically the case when acquisitions in the gaming space brought with them the promise of new and exciting games to play.
Microsoft has acquired ZeniMax, which means they have acquired Bethesda, and in turn, Skyrim, Fallout, Doom. All of Bethesda games now fall under the Microsoft catalog. And I wanted to get y'all's take on what this means for Xbox. Obviously, it's big, you know, Bethesda is one of the biggest publishers in games, but specifically Microsoft spent $7.5 billion securing ZeniMax Media.
It's like a Marvel and a half.
Right? Yeah. What they spend for Star Wars 2, half that?
I think it was around that. Yeah, around 4 billion. Something
pretty
like
wild. But yeah, this kind of expansion brings them to 23 studios from previously 15. So I'll go to you, AJ.
Wow.
Like, what does this mean to you? Do you think, like, are we going to see all these games?
It means we're going to get a freaking HD remaster of Home Alone, dude.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Can't wait.
Me too, man.
But no, like,
seminal
this is,
hit.
I just think that, like, it's going to be a net gain. I think that their games could potentially become better with more funding and hopefully.
Yeah. And I think that's like a two-way street, right? Like, not only are they acquiring the IP, they're acquiring, I would assume,
talent,
all the engines, the talent, the tech. Right. Bob, what do you think about all this news? Like,
I think most of it is Game Pass. I think they just need a lot of content on Game Pass, and I don't think they care about exclusives. I think most of the people who are playing Bethesda games are playing it on PC. Most of those Bethesda fans are PC fans. I think Microsoft just knows this is a big publisher, especially for PC, and if they do nothing, if they change nothing about Bethesda from now on, they will make that money back. I don't think that they are gonna make these games exclusive. I think that we'll see this stuff on PlayStation, and like AJ said, maybe a timed exclusive at best, but I don't even see that happening. I think they just want the software and they don't care where you play it.
I had the thought of potentially, like, I don't think they would touch, as far as exclusivity, the bigger titles like Fallout and Elder Scrolls. Like, I think I agree with you there. Like, those are going to be cross-platform,
Home Alone,
no matter what.
Remaster is going to be safe, dude. They got to put that on everything.
They can maybe get away with, like, some of the more niche, like I call it niche. I'm a massive fan of it, but Dishonored, like, that is a game that does not sell as well as a lot of the other games in the Bethesda series, but it has a big and, like, highly engaged fan base, right? Like, the people who are for it are really, they go for it. And I wonder if, like, they could do a spin-off or some sort of, like, separate game in that franchise that is exclusive, or maybe it's a longer term Xbox exclusive to see, like, play around with that.
A lot of the games that Bethesda are coming out with recently are a little broken. And
a little broken.
I think that they could benefit from somebody, like, you know, helping them out, but also I think that
accountability,
fans would be upset if Microsoft was like that sort of corporate overlord.
But now it feels like the consensus has shifted to being largely negative when we see the words merger or acquisition for any of the large corporations in games, except for when Nintendo's name is attached, which is interesting. As someone that's followed Nintendo's business decisions and the community's reaction to those decisions for nearly a decade, I'm used to the public's perception being on the complete opposite end of the spectrum in that regard. Unlike many of these times, that doesn't mean this difference in reaction doesn't make sense. I think there's a few reasons why this is the case, and I want to talk about those reasons, as well as something that may be a little controversial. I don't know, stick with me. I think it's reasonable, but we'll see if you agree. Before that, maybe you'll agree to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy what you see from this video. Maybe leave a comment with your thoughts on the topic. You know, you watch YouTube, the whole nine. Nintendo's structure as a company is relatively unique, especially when compared to their peers. And it feels like when you look at their output that they just have to own a lot of studios or even employ a bunch of people within those studios when compared to the field. But the reality is they don't actually own all that much. From my research at the time of recording, Nintendo employs around 8,000 people, which sounds like a lot. But bear in mind, this is Nintendo as a corporation overall, not just game development teams. I couldn't find an exact breakdown of how many of these employees specifically work on games, but even if we assumed all things were equal in terms of breakdowns, Xbox, not Microsoft, which currently in total has 221,000 employees, directly employs over 20,000 people for games. PlayStation, not Sony, which in total has 113,000 employees, directly employs nearly 13,000. As far as subsidiaries are concerned, Nintendo owns less than 20 distinct subsidiaries in total, with less than half of those being the result of a merger or acquisition. To put that into perspective, Xbox has acquired more studios than that in the last 5 years, let alone what they owned prior. And although they aren't nearly as bad, 14 of the 21 studios PlayStation owns were the result of an acquisition. Something many may be tempted to think in response to these discrepancies is that Nintendo is monetarily a much smaller company than the other two. That's certainly true. When compared with Microsoft, which is literally the most valuable corporation in the world to the tune of $3.2 trillion, Sony, on the other hand, is much closer to Nintendo in terms of market value, with their market cap being just shy of $100 billion, whereas Nintendo's valuation currently sits at a little over $60 billion. So while they are the smallest company of the three, it's not by as much as you would think, and in comparison with Sony in particular, Nintendo is the wealthiest company in all of Japan in terms of cash on hand. Sony isn't even on the list because of their amount of debt. So it's not like Nintendo couldn't afford to move similarly if they wanted. It's definitely an intentional difference, and not one they are forced into by being the smaller fish or anything like that. So with that in mind, to speak on why so many gamers have such negative opinions on the practice despite previously embracing it, pun not intended, but Embracer Group is relevant here. In a vacuum, I don't think there's anything wrong with building up a stable of teams for in-house development efforts, but the issue is they do tend to come with a cost, especially as of late. Oftentimes, studio acquisitions come part and parcel with mass layoffs. This year, Xbox laid off 1,900 people with the Activision Blizzard acquisition. PlayStation laid off 900 people this year. And in the absolute worst case, M&A can result in the relevant companies being dissolved or shut down entirely. In total, Xbox has consolidated, sold, or shut down 20 studios. PlayStation has done the same with 10. Again, these are numbers that totally eclipse Nintendo's entire history with the practice. In their 22 years of existence, Xbox has shut down more purchased companies than Nintendo has purchased ever in their 134 years as a company. That's insane. All of this said, I think the internet has the tendency to selectively ignore that Nintendo is indeed a multi-billion-dollar corporation that does do multi-billion-dollar corporation things. They have shut down studios, but most of them were in-house creations that's closures just resulted in the people that worked on them returning to their previous or at times better positions within the company. Or actual bad examples being a recent shakeup with how Nintendo handles game testers, resulting in over 100 people losing their jobs. I want to leave space to clearly state that this is bad and should have been avoided, period. However, and again, I want to be clear, this doesn't absolve them of what I just said, but this context is relevant to their public perception. This was partially them making good on a previous bad business decision they were guilty of in this space, where they were accused of taking advantage of contract work to get around paying testers outside of their in-house Mario Club team. So while over 100 people did lose work, which again is bad, there was some good to come of it, with some of those testers receiving full-time positions. This, I think, is part of why people don't tend to look at Nintendo the same way they do these other corporations. They do things differently because they generally have different motivations. Like, something that gets brought up often in times of mass layoffs is Satoru Iwata opting to have his salary during Nintendo's historically worst performance brought about by the failure of of Wii U. It's worth noting that Nintendo is a Japanese corporation, and the culture there has resulted in Japan's laws making it relatively complicated to have layoffs like the ones that we've been seeing recently. But even still, Sony is Japanese. I just mentioned them laying off 900 people this year. Sega is Japanese. They laid off 240 people this year. Square Enix is Japanese. They announced they're planning to do the same. And while Nintendo aren't entirely alone in this practice, Capcom raised their employee salary this year, or Konami hasn't reported any mass layoffs in over a decade. Most of the corporations that are as large or larger find a way to work around the laws in Japan to lay people off. So it's inaccurate to say Nintendo isn't worthy of praise here to some degree. They are exceptional when it comes to how they treat their staff. All of that said, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg on why people view Nintendo differently when it comes to M&A. After all, I don't think the general public even knows that layoffs occur and to what degree, and when they do, they certainly don't retain that information for very long. Something I do think is an even more impactful difference for Nintendo in this area of business is their intent behind each M&A development. Typically, mergers and acquisitions' core purpose is securing market share. This can be tangible in terms of adding the monetary benefits of a brand to your own, like Microsoft did with Activision Blizzard, really primarily Call of Duty. It's the number must go up mentality and the biggest culprit for the negative perception of M&A today. Or it's for mind share with consumers. They want to cut the line to building a legacy, like Microsoft did with Rare, for instance. Nintendo, on the other hand, never really gets in bed with corporations in this way for either of these reasons. Obviously, they have their own legacy, and even that wasn't built with the more publicly accepted approach that, say, Sony took with building the PlayStation brand by partnering with independent studios to make exclusive content for their platform until it became a no-brainer to acquire them. Mostly. There's some of that on Nintendo's end in their later years, of course, but most of their brands came as a result of them enabling talent to make something entirely new organically. Miyamoto applied for work and was at Nintendo nearly a decade before they entered the video game space and ultimately created Donkey Kong, Mario, Zelda, and many more iconic franchises. Game Freak, an independent company to this day, pitched Pokemon to Nintendo in 1990, and they were an instrumental part in its success. Kirby was a similar situation with HAL Laboratory, another studio that is independent to this day, requesting that Nintendo publish the game, and they again are responsible for many of what the franchise is today, down to the name. And the examples go on and on. Nintendo doesn't go on the prowl for promising teams they can poach and bring into the fold. They work with talent that admired their prior endeavors to bring their ideas to life, and they rarely actually end up taking ownership over the company they worked with to make it happen. In the instances where they have acquired teams outright, it was typically a result of that team being on the chopping block for one reason or another, i.e. Retro Studios. Click the card above for a video I made on their history a while back. Or more recently with Shiver Entertainment from Embracer Group to continue their assistance with porting games to Nintendo platform. And occasionally it's a near one-to-one approach to PlayStations where they acquire a studio they've long held a relationship with, presumably for increased control over their output and or developer support for other teams at Nintendo, like they did with Monolith Soft from Bandai Namco.
Yeah, so people will know me from Twitter, Stealth40K. I talk about Nintendo news and JRPG news and just general gaming news. Yeah, I just try and start the conversation. Many of the core Monolith Soft members actually started out working at Square, where they developed Xenogears. They weren't happy with really how their team was probably going to be used in the future, so they decided to kind of split off from Square to form their own company. And then they partnered up with Namco Bandai on a bunch of games. And at Namco Bandai, they were multi-platform, but obviously Xenosaga was only put on PS2. And then the relationship with Namco kind of soured. And Takahashi, who leads the team at Monolith Soft, had a relationship with Nintendo. They got to talking, and then, obviously it's more complicated than that, but then Nintendo bought out Namco's ownership shares.
Or more recently, Canadian independent studio Next Level Games. I think the combination of the pre-existing admiration these teams have for Nintendo, their use of these studios, and the infrequence of them outright acquiring them is another, albeit even bigger reason than the last for why Nintendo isn't looked at the same way as an Xbox here. All of that said, similar to how I don't think people know, think, or even care about layoffs long term, they certainly don't do any of that for the intent behind individual mergers and acquisitions either. What they do remember though is output. And I think that's because it's the most important way that Nintendo sets themselves apart from the field when it comes to M&A. I touched on individual examples from Nintendo a bit in the last section, but it's important to note what tends to happen with these studios is definitely the biggest reason people hate the concept of M&A these days. Xbox started their multi-billion-dollar spending spree about 5 years ago, and while some good games have come of it, they just shuttered the team that worked on Hi-Fi Rush, probably their most revered game of this era. And to make matters worse, even more mediocre to outright bad games have been released during this time period. That can only logically lead us to believe only bad can come of this, since even when these new teams do make a banger game, they are at risk of being cut for little more than their efforts not making up for other bad decisions within the conglomerate, or even worse, not being enough of the reason for their incessant need not just for profit, but continued exponential growth. It's unsustainable, and if I can say anything confidently about Nintendo after following them so closely through the worst of their business and the absolute peak of their business, it's that they have cared about sustainability above all else, and that has shown with how they utilize the resources they've acquired over the years. Again, look at Monolith Soft for example. This is one of their most important studios despite them not being solely responsible for Nintendo's biggest successes. Their games, they do decently enough. Xenoblade is at the point where it's good for 1 to 3 million units every time without fail. These by no means are numbers that most AAA studios today would be happy with. Just ask Square Enix. But Nintendo is clearly satisfied for two important reasons, and that's that one, the games themselves are made in such a way that the sales they can manage on a consistent basis are baked into their budget and are profitable on their own because of it, and two, Monolith serves as Nintendo's Swiss Army knife, having served as support staff on many of their major successes this generation.
Look at Monolith Soft's like game output. You know, they make the Xenoblade series, and those games haven't even sold more than 6 million copies. So from that perspective, like, are they important to Nintendo from the sales of their own games? Not necessarily. You know, it's good that Nintendo has like a big RPG franchise in their catalog. That's important. But to me, what their value is, besides being like really well managed, they help other Nintendo studios and games like get the most out of technology.
And it's clear that this approach has been with Nintendo for some time now. Look at one of the games that Monolith Soft helped out with, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This is a massive open world game that Nintendo had a sales target of 2 million units for. It sold like 15 times that, but the fact still remains that they used this development as a means to establish resources that would in part facilitate the development of future games, and that was brilliant. They make their resources stretch longer than literally anyone else in the industry, and that is true from everything to the companies they've acquired down to the games those companies end up making.
You know, we don't exactly know how much Monolith Soft helped on both Zelda games that came to Switch, but like when you look at really how seamless and how huge Tears of the Kingdom's world is with the air traversal and then the ground and underground, it's kind of remarkable that it's running on Switch.
And it's not just Monolith Soft. Retro Studios also has been known to support the creation of major Nintendo games from other studios within the company, and the purchase of Shiver tells me that they don't have any plans to slow down, and instead it's clear that they intend to increase their use of this approach. It's here where I think Nintendo could stand to go even further in the acquisition department. I think Nintendo should not only continue to buy smaller studios like Shiver Entertainment to primarily play support roles as is necessary, but also I think acquiring another Monolith Soft or Retro Studio level developer that leads heavy hitters of their own would make a lot of sense. Bandai Namco. I'm talking about Bandai Namco. I've said this before and I will continue to say it unless or until it becomes a reality. If there's any Xbox level acquisition Nintendo should make, it would be them for various reasons, with the least of which being their IP. Like sure, there's no doubt Nintendo would benefit a lot from owning a character like Pac-Man, but like I mentioned before, Nintendo doesn't need to do this. Their roster of IP is entirely unmatched within gaming. I'd argue the only corporation in all of entertainment on the planet, let alone within the gaming industry, with IP that even compares is Disney and maybe Warner Brothers if we're being generous. The most important strength of Bandai Namco Namco that they can offer Nintendo, though, is their development staff. So much so that I would argue Nintendo could stand to push for a deal where they only acquire parts of the company, like the teams working on their newly established Nintendo support division. That said, the very existence of Studio S and Studio 2 is a strong argument for Nintendo not to spend the money needed to make an acquisition like this. After all, a big thing, which I didn't spend much time talking about, that sets Nintendo apart in the M&A realm is they don't need to spend a dime to convince studios to work with them. There are plenty of studios falling over themselves to partner with Nintendo to have the opportunity to make their mark on Nintendo's IP, and that is true. Koei Tecmo has spent the last 2 Nintendo generations supporting Nintendo platforms in this way. Platinum Games, to a certain extent, Ubisoft, Square Enix, and the list of studios voluntarily supporting Nintendo is primed to expand with the coming generation. I agree that this, in most instances, is a strong argument against Nintendo going wild with acquiring studios, but I think Bandai Namco is an exception where if Nintendo owned them, or at the very least the teams responsible for games like the last couple of Smash Bros titles, Pokemon projects like Pokken and new Pokemon Snap, as well as Mario Kart in addition to more, it would afford them increased control over their output as well as increased efficiency, like I mentioned with the other studios they fully acquired.
I just kind of thought it was just a collection of like random employees who were doing it. But now we kind of know what the structure is, and yeah, it was those 2 studios who helped make it. I do think that they're going to be working on the next Smash Brothers game. Smash Brothers Ultimate is approaching 35 million sold on Switch, which is remarkable. So the idea that Nintendo doesn't want to do Smash Brothers and Namco doesn't want to do Smash Brothers is ludicrous to me. So I think at least one of their projects is the next Smash Brothers game.
I want Bandai Namco to work on literally every mainline Pokemon game. I want them to eventually be able to entirely take over Smash when Sakurai inevitably is ready to retire. I want them to show us what they can cook up on their own when given the reins of a Nintendo project of their own on the level of a Kid Icarus Uprising or even bigger. I know the spirit of M&A is in the air and getting out of control, but I think Nintendo has approached it with tact up until now, and upping the ante a little bit with Bandai Namco doesn't have to change that, especially if it's just a partial acquisition of some of their resources rather than the entire company. Their history working with Nintendo is extensive, and they have contributed some of their highest quality, most successful games of all time, let alone of recent memory. Something that has proven to be important when it comes to working with Nintendo is the ability to gel with them culturally, and Bandai Namco having this catalog of successful Nintendo projects demonstrates that they check off that box just fine. Obviously, this would be Nintendo's biggest acquisition as far as cultural impact and monetarily, especially if they opted to acquire the entire company. But it's one that I'm sure they could swing with their enormous war chest of cash on hand if they truly wanted to. It's not exactly likely or anything. I wouldn't bet the bank on them doing this. I don't even think they need it, but it's hard to deny how much sense it'd make for Nintendo to do, particularly if they're truly committed to improving the cultural standing of modern day Pokemon games. Same with solidifying the future sustainability of Smash games. These 2 properties alone are worth a multi-billion-dollar investment, and if handled in the right way, would easily pay off in spades in no time at all. But that's just what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you to Redirect's first ever executive producer, Trev L. Steinberg, and all of these other great names you see scrolling on the screen for keeping this channel afloat. If you'd like to join them and get other cool perks like exclusive content, access to community events, Nintendo themed merch, you can find all of that and more at shop.watchredirect.com, linked in the description, or follow me on Twitch and other social media. The best way to support is subscribe and ring the bell to be notified whenever new videos go live. Okay, that's it for me. See you in the next video.